I podcast, therefore I am, said one of the great philosophical thinkers of our time.
Was it you?
In today's podcast, we're going to try and give you a complete history of philosophy in about 30 minutes, from Socrates to Jean-Paul Sartre, without all the boring bits. Welcome to
Aprender Inglés with Reza and Craig.
Hi, I'm Reza.
And my name's Craig.
And with more than 50 years of teaching between us, we'll help you improve your English and take it to the next level. So, Craig, how are things?
Things are very well. I'm feeling rather philosophical today, and I'd like to say that the past is history, the future is a mystery, but this moment is a gift, and that's why it's called the present.
Ooh.
Who said that?
I don't know, but I like it. That's poetry. That's deep. Who said that?
Kung Fu Panda.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
What a philosopher he is.
This isn't the first time we've attempted to cover a huge, big topic in one short podcast, is it?
Indeed. And also, it's not the first time we've tried to teach you about something that we know nothing about ourselves. But it's never stopped us before, and it won't stop us now.
Not at all. We have tried and actually succeeded to talk about the history of Britain in 20 minutes. You can listen to that by going to inglespodcast.com/153. What other huge subjects have we tackled in a time limit, Reza?
Also, the entire history of the English language in 20 minutes. I think we even tried to uncover the mystery of phrasal verbs there, but I'm not sure if we did. What else have we done, Craig?
Well, that one you mentioned, the history of the English language, you need to go to inglespodcast.com/320. We have spoken about phrasal verbs, a brief history of phrasal verbs. Go to inglespodcast.com/331. We've also spoken about the history of American English in 20 minutes. Go to inglespodcast.com/335.
That's right, 20 minutes. Goddamn right. And we had 5 minutes to spare.
But today we're talking about a history of philosophy in hopefully under 30 minutes. What is philosophy, Reza?
Ooh, where do you begin? Well, let's see. You could say philosophy is like the study of the big questions about life and about knowledge and the universe and everything and existence, I guess. I suppose it's to try and help us understand how we think and why we believe certain things. But of course, not everybody agrees. So that's why there are many different important movements and different philosophers in the history of philosophy who've thought about things in different ways and have had very different ideas and ways of looking at things. Maybe the best thing to do is if we start by talking about the early philosophers. Let's start at that. Let's start at the start. Why not?
Let's start at the start. Well, I'm sure people philosophized before this, but the ancient Greeks are famous for starting it all. Thinkers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, they started asking questions about things like knowledge, happiness, how to live a good life, for example. So many people agree that the ancient Greeks and ancient Greek philosophy, they laid the groundwork for Western philosophy. And that word groundwork, if you imagine a building, when you want to build a structure, you need good foundations. You need to go down deep to make sure the building stands up, that it's steady. And that's the groundwork that the ancient Greeks laid for philosophy.
Right. And as Craig's already said, we're starting with the Greeks because they're the main reference point when you talk about the history of philosophy. in the West, in the Western world. We'll talk about other movements later because we realize we have a lot of listeners, not only from South America, but also from Asia. And in fact, all over the world. We got people listening in Australia and Russia and all over the place. So from a Western standpoint, we tend to take the starting point to be Greece, but we know that in other parts of the world, they had their own philosophy. We'll get to that a little bit later. So Craig already mentioned Socrates. So he's known for really asking questions to help people think deeply about their beliefs. It seems pretty obvious now, but it wasn't so obvious 3 or 4 or 5,000 years ago. So Socrates really came up with what we now refer to as the Socratic method, the idea of thinking deeply about your beliefs.
Another famous Greek is Plato. I mentioned him at the beginning. He was a student of Socrates who wrote about justice. He spoke about beauty and the ideal state. And he founded the academy in Athens. So Plato came after Socrates.
When I was a kid, I used to always get confused between the word Plato and Pluto. And Pluto can be a planet.
The planet or the cartoon character?
Well, it was the cartoon character that I was interested in. So I used to have a bit of confusion between, people used to talk about the importance of Plato. And as a kid, I thought, yeah, that cartoon dog does play a very important part in my life. But I was thinking about Pluto. I think in Spanish, people say Platón, by the way. Yeah, but in English, it's Plato. We've already mentioned Socrates and Plato. You can't have them without mentioning another member of the group, Aristotle. So he was a student of Plato who wrote about many subjects such as science, ethics, talking about what's right, what's wrong, and politics. And he believed in studying the natural world. So the reason why in the West we go back to Greece as a starting point is because the words they're all Greek words. These words, politics, philosophy, democracy, they're all originally Greek words which have got slightly transformed. In English, democracy, in Spanish, democracia, but they all are Greek words. So we credit them with the ideas, particularly Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates.
But let's move away from the West now and from Greece and go over to the East and Eastern philosophy, countries like China and India. Confucius in China, he focused on social harmony, good government, and he played a very important role in the development of philosophy, especially in the East. And of course, one of my favorites, Buddha in India. He explored achieving peace and freedom from suffering, saying that all humans suffer, basically. And it's a really good idea, and I agree with him, to do what you can so that you suffer less. He famously found enlightenment and reached nirvana. That's not the music group Nirvana. That's the state of euphoria and feeling completely free from suffering.
Craig, am I right in thinking you once told me, have you visited what they call the Buddha tree?
No, I haven't. I met the Dalai Lama once, but I didn't. Well, he was in India, but he wasn't in the area where the Buddha tree is, apparently.
So the Dalai Lama is considered by many people to be the head of the Buddhist movement in a way. What was he like? What was it like to meet him?
He looked tired and it was just a really brief meeting. He came in front of me, said hello, smiled. He gave me a thread, a holy thread that you put around your wrist. And we were standing in a long line of people, tourists who had come to pay respects to him. So he just passes down the line with his helpers and just smiles at you and then moves on to the next person. But it was lovely to see him in the flesh, but we didn't actually speak.
And did he give off good vibrations?
He looked like a really kind, gentle, wise, intelligent, peaceful, tired old man. So there was nothing outworldly about him. There was no God feeling, which is one thing I really like about Buddhism, is there isn't a God as such. I don't think Buddha really was thought of as a God. He was just thought of as a man who reached this special level of understanding and enlightenment.
Shall we carry on with our history of Western philosophy? Shall we get back to Europe and the West?
Yes, let's.
So we've already mentioned the Greeks, who Craig said did the groundwork. They laid the stones, let's say. Then after them, we could talk about medieval philosophy. So they used the Greek ideas, but remember the Greeks, of course, weren't what we would consider religious people. Well, they had their own gods, but they didn't think like Hindus or Muslims or Christians or Jews. They had their own ideas. So the medieval philosophers mixed those Greek ideas with the religion of the time. So in the West, we're talking about Christianity. For example, St. Augustine, he combined Christian theology with Platonic ideas, the ideas of Plato. And he wrote about the nature of God and the human soul. So he kind of fused the two things together.
And Thomas Aquinas, he did something similar. He integrated Aristotle's Greek philosophy with more modern Christian doctrine or religion. And he argued or believed that reason, or let's say logic, and faith in God, for example, can coexist, which is strange to me because they seem in opposition to one another. You've got science and, let's say, fact on one side, and you've got religion, faith and belief on the other. They seem to be opposed against each other. You've got Darwin evolution on one side and God creating man on the other side. And some people believe one thing, some people believe the other. Thomas Aquinas tried to mix the two together.
So there was a bit of philosophy going on in the medieval period, but not that much. Christianity was more the dominant force in the West. But later came the period known as the Renaissance. So that's a French word which has got into English, which just means the rebirth, if you like. And the Enlightenment, as Craig already said, seeing the light, finally understanding things. So the Renaissance brought a renewed focus on human potential, something which the Greeks spoke a lot about, but got a little bit lost in the medieval period. So it came back into fashion in the Renaissance. And the Enlightenment put emphasis on pure science and reason. So, for example, we could start with René Descartes. So he was a French philosopher, very famous for his quote, which we deliberately misquoted at the beginning of the episode. The real quote was, "I think, therefore I am." I think we said, "I podcast, therefore I am." So we were fooling around with Descartes' famous quotation.
Or did we say, "I think, therefore I podcast"? I can't remember.
Yeah. Which came first, the chicken or the egg, the podcasting or the bean? We don't know. Oh, very philosophical.
But yeah, Descartes, he questioned everything to find out what we can really, truly know. How do we know that we exist? He focused on consciousness. Who are we really? When you think, oh, I'm Craig, that's my identity. I'm Reza, that's his identity. But who are we really? So he basically questioned everything down to the essence, the very nucleus, the fact of who we are.
Another important philosopher from this period is John Locke. And he believed in natural rights. And also the idea that the mind is a blank slate. A slate, that black material that's used for blackboards that you can write on. So a blank slate at birth. In other words, it depends what you learn, it depends what you experience. That will determine what kind of person you are. And his ideas have greatly influenced modern democracy, for example.
Some politicians have a blank mind now, never mind at birth, in my opinion.
That's true.
Another name you might come across is Immanuel Kant. He explored how we understand the world around us and morality. He looked very closely at how moral we are. And he proposed or suggested that we have a duty to follow moral laws.
Another person on our list is Francis Bacon. He emphasized the importance of natural philosophy, but at the same time guided by scientific method. In other words, natural science was really his thing.
Let's take a quick break here because I know you listen to this podcast to take your English to the next level. But what about your speaking? Is your fluency improving? Are you happy with your speaking skills? My conversation course focuses on making you a more confident and more fluent English speaker. You'll join me and a small group of motivated students, and we'll meet on Zoom and have topical discussions, role plays, debates, and presentations that will expand your vocabulary and help you express yourself effectively in English. So be proactive and take the first step towards becoming a confident and fluent English speaker. Send me an email today to craig@inglespodcast.com and I'll send you details of the next online conversation course. Thanks for listening. Now let's get back to the podcast. And finally on our list, we have Voltaire. And that was not actually his real name. Voltaire, as we know him by, quite a famous name, that Voltaire. But his real name, and I'll probably mispronounce this, as a French chap, François-Marie Arouet. You can see all of these names in the show notes, inglespodcast.com/532. What did Voltaire propose? Well, he focused on logic, the individual rights of humans, and he used reason and logic to question everything. So he looked at philosophy from a scientific angle. He didn't just blindly accept what people told him. He wanted proof, and he encouraged people to think for themselves freely. Now, he lived in a time when that was not very popular because obviously people believed in God at that time. And to examine everything and demand proof and logic, which is really critical thinking, isn't it? Being critical about the information you have in front of you. So it was quite revolutionary during Voltaire's time.
Now let's fast forward a little bit to the 19th century, and things begin to get a little bit more radical and a bit more extreme, a bit more defined, let's say. So on the one hand, we have, for example, Karl Marx. I'm sure most listeners have heard about him. Everybody's heard about Marxism. As you probably know, he was very critical of capitalism, and he wrote about the class struggle, Marxism. He believed in the importance of economic systems in shaping society. So that's how he came up with the idea of Marxism, which was all about stopping capitalism and distributing the wealth somehow amongst everybody in some equal way, theoretically.
And also in the 19th century, we have Friedrich Nietzsche, who was quite controversial in his time. He questioned traditional values and religion, and the controversial idea of the Übermensch, or Superman, which was promoted and maybe we could say exploited after he died by Nazi Germany. So he believed in natural selection, the survival of the fittest, and the Nazis kind of took that on as their philosophy as well.
Have you noticed, listeners, that when we jumped to the 19th century, we focused on two German philosophers, Nietzsche and Marx. Before that, there was some French, some British, but the early ones were all Greek. So both Greece and Germany are very important countries when it comes to philosophy. And it reminds me of a really funny sketch The Monty Python football sketch between the philosophers. Have you ever seen it?
Yeah, it's very funny.
Germany versus Greece in a football match, but they're all philosophers. So all they got to do is get the ball in the net, but they can't because they think about life too much. Oh, Marx is thinking about, but is it fair if I keep the ball? It has to be shared with everyone. And Socrates thinking, do I really want to put this ball in the net? So nobody kicks the ball in the net. It's very funny. If you get a chance, go to YouTube or somewhere or Google and put in Monty Python philosophy football match or something like that, and you'll get it. Germany versus Greece in a philosophy football match is very funny.
It's hilarious. It's very, very good.
But let's jump to even closer to modern times. Let's jump to the 20th century. And we're going to go French again. France, another important country when it comes to philosophy in the West. I think Craig already mentioned Jean-Paul Sartre. So he would be labeled by most people as an existentialist. So someone interested in the very existence of our lives. And he believed that people create their own meaning in life. Yeah, that it's not something that comes from outside. So he believed very much in individual freedom and individual responsibility.
I agree with that. I think we should take responsibility for our own situation. We shouldn't be blaming other people or blaming the government or blaming our parents or blaming immigrants. We should accept responsibility for our own life and our own destiny, I think. Going back to Germany, we've got Ludwig Wittgenstein, who focused on studying language and the limits of language. He argued that many philosophical problems really come from misunderstanding, from not understanding each other when we use language. And of course, language can be misleading. Language is limiting, whatever language you speak, and language also identifies us. You've got a very strong identity connected to language.
That reminds me of a person who you could say is partly a philosopher, still alive today, although pretty old. Noam Chomsky. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you know, because he knows a hell of a lot about language and linguistics, but he also knows a hell of a lot about philosophy. So he's a very interesting person for an English teacher like Craig or I to read about and find out their ideas. Noam Chomsky is perhaps a modern version, although much altered, of Wittgenstein.
Yeah, he's been very influential in language teaching. I remember studying him for taking a language exam, for teaching exam. So he's been very influential, Chomsky.
We got another Frenchman now in the 20th century, forgive my pronunciation, Michel Foucault, I think it's pronounced. And he examined how power and knowledge are connected. He studied institutions like prisons and hospitals. So the kind of institutions where power, who's in control, is really important. And what you know determines how good or how bad your existence is.
Let's move on from individual philosophers to philosophical movements in general. But before we look at those, Reza, a question for you. How many philosophers does it take to change a light bulb?
Ooh, I have no idea. How many does it take?
Well, it depends. Does the light bulb really want to change?
Oh, very good. You got me there. I walked into that one.
I thought you'd like that. Stoicism.
Sorry, Gray, I got to hit you back with one. Sort of connected to philosophy as well, a branch of philosophy. How many surrealists, a branch of philosophy in a way, how many surrealists does it take to change a light bulb?
Is the light bulb really there? Is that the answer?
The answer is fish. They are surrealists. They're surrealists, what can I say?
What do you call a fish with no eye?
No eye. So the reindeer's no idea. So the fish is going to be no, I don't know.
It's a fish.
Oh, very good. Very good.
Moving on to one of my favorites again. I like this philosophical movement, Stoicism. Stoicism, that focuses on personal virtue and wisdom. The Stoics were the people who believed in accepting what we cannot change.
We've already touched on existentialism, We were talking about people like Jean-Paul Sartre. So what is this existentialism? Well, it emphasizes individual freedom and responsibility, and existentialists, the people who believe in it, explore the meaning of life itself and human existence. Questions such as, why are we here? What are we doing here?
Yeah, that would be Descartes, wouldn't it? He would be that school of philosophy. Next, we have empiricism, and empiricism emphasizes knowledge, but through sensory experience, what we experience by using our senses, smell, sight, hearing, etc. Key figures of empiricism include Francis Bacon, John Locke, who we've mentioned, and also David Hume.
The next important movement we want to talk about is rationalism. So if you're rational, that means there's a good reason for doing what you do or thinking what you think. So rationalism believes that reason is the primary source of knowledge. Important figures in that movement would be, again, people like Descartes and also Immanuel Kant.
Earlier we spoke about Wittgenstein and his focus on language. Well, there's a branch of philosophy called analytic philosophy, and that concentrates on language and logic. So it aims to clarify philosophical problems using analysis of the language that we use.
And the last movement we want to talk about is known as continental philosophy. So that includes a range of approaches. It's not just one, it's a range. And it's from countries in continental Europe, such as Germany and France, above all. And it often focuses on history, culture, and society. In other words, it looks at how we humans experience the world. That's often referred to as continental philosophy.
And that concludes our brief history of philosophy in 30 minutes. And I think we've just about made it, Reza, in under 30 minutes. But now it's your turn to practice your English. Which area or period of philosophy interests you the most? I've spoken about Stoicism that I quite like, and I'm interested in that, and also Buddhism. What areas interest you, Reza?
Rationalism. I like the idea of being rational. And also, I'm interested in following ideas that I don't like. So I really don't like many of Nietzsche's ideas, but I find it interesting to read about them and try to figure out why some people do like them.
Interesting. And what about you listening to this? We'd love to hear from you and get your viewpoint. Send us a voice message. You can do that by going to speakpipe.com. That's speakpipe.com/Ingles podcast. We prefer to hear your voice, so let us know where you're from. But if you want to send us an email, we also accept emails. I'm Craig, Craig, @inglespodcast.com. And to contact Reza, write to belfastreza, Reza, @gmail.com.
If you're a Spanish speaker and you're interested in some paid material, why not visit the Mansión Inglés website and check out the ebooks, audios, and other self-study material there. There's a link in the show notes to store, S-T-O-R-E, store.mansioningles.net.
And we cannot leave you this week without thanking our lovely Patreon supporters. You too can be part of our Patreon program for as little as $1.50 per month. And what that means is that apart from supporting this podcast, you also get instant access to the transcriptions so that you can read every single word that we say. Go to patreon.com, patreon.com/Ingles podcast for more information. And as usual, you'll find that link in the show notes.
We'd like to say thank you to every single one of our Patreon supporters, but we haven't got time to mention every name. So, as we do at the end of every episode, we're going to mention the most recent sponsors who've just joined the scheme, and they are Jessica Negrier, Ronaldo Niño, and Walter Thangwe.
Yes, thank you to you and to everybody who is supporting us on Patreon. If you've enjoyed this week's podcast, please tell your friends so that more people can listen. And next week, we're talking about bags. Everything from suitcases to clutch bags. Bag vocabulary unpacked next week. Until next time, thanks for listening this week. It's goodbye from me.
And bye-bye from me.
The music in this podcast is by Pitts. The track is called See You Later.